and welcome back to my channel, CSM Mistakes Were Made. In this video I want to show how I crank the edge of some socks that I normally knit, crew socks. I just knit these for my husband, and the Selvage involves a Juana's 1x1 cast on, which is a very nice cast on to learn if you are friends with your ribber. And then in addition to Juana's cast on, right after you succeed in casting on, you turn your tappet plate to out of work and crank 2 out rows. And what that does is it builds up kind of a nice edge for the top of a cuff. Now, these are especially nice fluffy socks because I've used sport weight yarn, and I'll be honest, the other socks that I knit using that same Selvage aren't quite as dramatic looking. Here's a set of socks or a sock I did. Here's another sock, and so it's not quite as dramatic as this really fluffy sport weight yarn. In fact, this one is the most recent one I've done, and it looks kind of thin, but I think most of the time I'm very pleased with how my socks turn out. It's a very stretchy selvage, and in most cases it's very nice looking. Again, I'm not that crazy about this particular one. I do want to share that there's an edge that you can get by just doing Juana's Selvage and no out rows, just going straight into the 1x1 cuff, that is quite attractive and quite clean looking and quite elegant looking. And this is just what would happen if you don't do the out rows, and it's just simply Juana's cast on. It's a beautiful, simple, elegant edge. These socks were gifted to me by one of the most experienced crankers in our area, and this is her go-to selvage, so you might consider that. It's very nice. The one thing I think is kind of ironic is that this selvage hand knitters would kill to have, and there is, I believe, a type of cast on for hand knitting socks that gets you this edge, and it's something I used to do as a hand knitter called the Italian cast on, I believe. I've left a link in the description if you wanted to check it out. But what's ironic is that the simple Juana's cast on gets you there with the machine, and if you try to do this by hand, well, let's just say I have to always go back to refresh my memory about how to do it. It's not as straightforward as a simple long tail cast on. But anyway, those are some cast on ideas. I did type up some directions. Some people like to have something to refer to. You can get a copy of this by going to a link in the description. I think it's on Google Drive, so I'll leave that. It's a PDF file. You can have that. And thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and share your comments and suggestions if you have them. Thanks. Hi, please join me as I do a Juana's cast on using my 60 slot cylinder and my 60 slot ribber. I will start with the landmarks here. These are my halfway marks. So I'm sitting roughly with this half of the cylinder to the front and this half to the back. My landmarks that I will point out are this important one, needle number 1, which is also corresponding with 3 o'clock. I use the face of a clock. You can see even my digital watch has the analog face. So I'm accustomed to 12, 3, 6, and 9. I'm going to carefully crank around so that my yarn carrier is at 6 o'clock, or maybe a little past 6 o'clock. You don't want it to get too close to the first needle that you install your split ring bonnet onto, which in my case I usually use needle number 1 to start things off. So we keep our yarn carrier well behind the first needle that we loaded. We'll get some waste yarn on the machine and install that. I usually just kind of hold it down until I get going, and we do the rest of our split rings, and we're set. Okay, so I wrap that around a little bit so it doesn't create a gap. Get my stem weights and crank around. The last socks I made were really heavy duty socks for my husband with very, very thick yarn. So I'm going to tighten my tension for the yarn that I'm going to be using, which is an active fingering weight yarn, and this is active in the emerald colorway, I believe. I have a big cone of it. I will take the last of this waste yarn and put it on the needle, needle number 1, and then install 1 row of ravel cord. I love ravel cord. It's, in this case, a braided fishing line. It's very helpful when you want to separate waste yarn from the working yarn. And I think it's really helpful for people like me who don't like to waste their waste yarn. We reuse it a lot, so this will avoid the situation where you have to cut it off the sock, cut the waste yarn off. All right, so that's set. Cast on bonnet is on, waste yarn is on, 1 row of ravel cord beginning and ending on needle number 1. Now we'll start Juana's cast on. And I like to do Juana's cast on because it's a very nice 1x1 cast on. Just are locked and won't unravel. So now I'm going to start my project yarn and through the yarn carrier, and I'm careful so that needle number 1 grabs the yarn. All right. All right, once we have a small tail in the cylinder, the needle number 1 has the first loop of the working yarn. Everything is set. I'll crank 3/4 of a row from basically 3 o'clock all the way to 6 o'clock, maybe a little past. And that's our first row. So that now we'll take our ribber assembly, put it on our machine. You can see this blue and that blue line up. So it's nice to paint your ribber so that you can easily identify if it's aligned properly. So now I'm going to grab ribber needles to install in the ribber dial. Grab the running thread, do an alley-oop, and place it in the ribber dial. Start the ribber needle face down, hook down. Sometimes you can see the yarn you're going after and just grab it and flip it over. Sometimes you may need to pull an adjacent needle out just to expose that running thread. And especially when you're working on the far side of the cylinder, and you know, this sometimes is harder to see, at least it is for me. So we put all of these in, hook side down, grab the yarn, flip it over, install. One thing to be careful of is that if you do everything right, hook side down, grab the thread, but the needle goes too far, that latch will close and it'll fall off and you'll have a drop stitch. So there is a little bit of wiggle room so that this butt end of the needle can slide down just in time, leaving, I would say, about 3 millimeters of the latch to see that it's in the right position. But it is not a hard mistake to make. So we keep going all the way around. It eventually will be stopped because the ribber arm makes it so it's hard to see. So my sight line, it's all obscured right there. So what I do is I go as far as I can, maybe one more, get that last bit. And now, truly starting Juana's cast on. At this point, we've loaded about half of the ribber needle, so we haven't really done much. But now, when I move this ribber assembly around, I will be starting Juana's cast on. These needles that I've placed will actually start doing their job. So let's make sure that the ribber switch is switched to in work. And we don't need our counter, so I'm going to crank forward and get a few of those done. And so now I've opened up all of the rest of the slots of the ribber to load. But it is important to recognize that this now we've actually started Juana's cast on. We hadn't started until we just moved it. Once those ribber needles start to knit, that is the beginning of Juana's cast on. What I'll do with Juana's cast on is an additional 2 rows after I've gone around once, so that I can get kind of a nice rolled edge at the top of my cuff. And so I'll call this what they sometimes are referring to it as the hybrid cast on, or a crew sock selvage. And it is a beautiful selvage that I do for most socks that I use ribbing for. So again, we'll finish the last few of these needles and load them onto the ribber. You can see that I think I have 2 more to do, and that's getting in my way, so I'm going to crank just a little further forward. So now I've exposed those and I can get the last 2 in. A couple of interesting landmarks that we'll be using for this in-out business is we'll need to recognize, again, needle number 1. Right before needle number 1 is the last ribber needle. And here's the last cylinder needle. So somewhere between these two, the last ribber needle and the last cylinder needle, is where I want to make my change to out. I'll show you. I use the landmark that now when I bring it around, this landmark, I'm going to have that point at the last ribber needle and somewhere in between the last cylinder needle and last ribber needle. So somewhere before needle number 1. And I think machines are made differently, but if you have a machine with a ribber, there's some landmark on your tappet plate that should be a reliable landmark for you to know that when you push, in this case I'm pushing my ribber needles, my tappet plate out of work. And it doesn't really look like I've done that, because as soon as I push this in the out position, the ribber needles jutted out. That is a good sign that I've done it right, that I've got it in the right place. What I've done is taken my ribber out of work, and the needle that I want it to affect first is this needle. That's the first ribber needle after 3 o'clock. So when I crank around, these will all get the yarn for the first time. This one on the next pass will not take the yarn. These are out rows, and I'm going to do 2 of them. So we crank forward, we do 1, 2, and now I take the same landmark. I'm going to stop it right here again and put my ribber back in work. Those now tuck in because they need a round where they don't take the yarn, and this one will now start back into work. So that's Juana's cast on. I'll show an example of what it looks like when I get this off the machine.